Good afternoon, everyone. എല്ലാവരും വിഭവസമൃദ്ധമായ ഓണസദ്യ ആസ്വദിച്ചു എന്ന് വിശ്വസിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് നമ്മുടെ അടുത്ത സെഷനിലേക്ക് പ്രവേശിക്കാം. ആരും ഉറങ്ങിപ്പോകരുത്, കാരണം ഇതൊരു ഇൻട്രസ്റ്റിംഗ് ടോപ്പിക്കാണ്. ആങ്സൈറ്റി, സ്ട്രെസ്സ്, ഇതൊന്നും എക്സ്പീരിയൻസ് ചെയ്യാത്ത ആൾക്കാരും നമ്മുടെ ഇടയിൽ ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കത്തില്ലല്ലോ. സോ അടുത്ത സെഷൻ ലീഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് ഈ ഇടവകയുടെ സൺഡേ സ്കൂളിൻ്റെയും യൂത്ത് ഫെലോഷിപ്പിൻ്റെയും ഒരു പ്രോഡക്റ്റ് എന്ന് വിശേഷിപ്പിക്കാവുന്ന ഒരു വ്യക്തിയാണ് ഡോക്ടർ ഏബൽ മാത്യു. ഇപ്പോൾ അദ്ദേഹം ഫോറൻസിക് ന്യൂറോസൈക്കോളജിസ്റ്റ് ആയിട്ട് പ്രവർത്തിക്കുന്നു. UT സൗത്ത് വെസ്റ്റേൺ മെഡിക്കൽ സെൻറ്റർ സൈക്കോളജി ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ് അഡ്ജങ്ക് പ്രൊഫസറായിട്ടും സേവനമനുഷ്ഠിക്കുന്നു. സോ ഏറ്റവും സന്തോഷത്തോടു കൂടി സ്ട്രെസ്, സാഡ്നെസ് ആൻഡ് സൊല്യൂഷൻസ് എന്ന ഈ വിഷയത്തെപ്പറ്റി സെഷൻസ് ലീഡ് ചെയ്യാനായി ഡോക്ടർ ഏബലിനെ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു.
Check. All right, this is on. All right, hello, good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here to present on a topic that is so near and dear to my heart, talking about psychological symptoms, stress, sadness, and solutions. So I've titled this that because honestly, it sounded really good. It all started with the letter S, but I really think it's something that we all experience. We've all had anxiety or depressive-like symptoms, but I think the question is, well, what do we do about it? And how do we do this? How do we go forward in a faith-based way that makes the most sense? And also, if we ourselves haven't experienced a ton of anxiety or a ton of depression, we know somebody that might have been experiencing some of those things. So I think that this is still really relevant for all of us here. So I think this is a really good full circle moment because my parents reminded me that in 1998, I attended the first Yuvajana Sakhyam conference. So this is a lot of fun for me to be here and be able to present today. And thank you to the Yuvajana Sakhyam National Committee, as well as to the Achins, Thirumeni, everybody else here. I really appreciate it. So when I talk about mental health, I encompass this in an umbrella where we're talking about emotional, psychological, and social well-being. So when I talk about emotional, I'm talking about the feelings that we experience, psychological, how our thoughts are going, and then finally our social well-being, so how we interact with others. And if any of one of those things are out of transition with one another, it can affect our mental health indirectly. And I think it's especially relevant for us as Indians living in America, because whether you immigrated from India to America or whether you were born and raised here and lived your life here in its entirety, you yourself are experiencing this acculturation type period where you have to adjust to what the society's demands are. So I think it's really important for us to understand that. In 2023, the American Psychological Association made this study where they actually evaluated people's stress levels and wanted to do so after the pandemic to see how individuals were doing. And for the most part, people rated their physical health and their mental health really good. But I want to draw our attention to this diagram here in the green box, where they identified that 24% of individuals were diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and 23% were diagnosed with a depressive disorder. And if we just put that in context here, that's about 1 in 5 people are being diagnosed with a clinically high level of anxiety and depression. And so then they decided to ask, well, why is this happening? So as you can see here in the diagrams, the younger you are, the higher your stress levels are. And then as you start to age, your stress levels start to go down. So we first see here that when we think about the social aspects of things, these individuals are reporting that they feel a lot of stress because they don't want to burden others. They have less patience for others. If you think about the psychological pieces, stress makes it harder for them to focus. It can't do anything. They feel functionally impaired by their stress. And then finally, when we look at the emotional piece, these individuals were reporting that their stress is so overwhelming that they sometimes even feel numb, like they don't even feel emotions at all. But what's interesting is when we look at other research studies, if you look here, you can see across the age lifespan, despite your gender or your race, there tends to be a point where your depressive symptoms go down and then they start going back up. And that age that they start going back up is right about age 35. So Yuvajana Sakhyam age, be aware because something might be coming, right? And the question is, well, why? Why is this happening? And I think that a lot of researchers have identified the concept of the midlife crisis, right? So we start to wonder in our identity, is this really it? Is this all that I've lived for? Is this the job that I wanted? Is this like how my family is always going to be? And then there's also a mortality piece here, right? Where we have family members that we've deeply known, whether that be parents or siblings or close friends, that start passing away. And so it's no surprise that there tends to be an increase in level of sadness here too. And then finally, this study compared women and men. And they found that women tend to report higher levels of stress as it relates to money and family relational stress. But I would 100% guarantee you that when you ask men this question, they would be more concerned about the money and they're unaware of the family and relational stress that's going on, right? And to further highlight this, women tend to be more forthright about how they're feeling and what's going on, and men don't tend to do so. And if you don't believe me, some research studies have even identified suicide rates by gender, and we know that men have higher rates of completed suicide than women do. So this is clearly something that affects us despite if we're a man or a woman, regardless of what age we are, and regardless of what race we are too. And so the question is, well, now that we've laid down the framework, what is anxiety and depression? And I'm really going to focus on just these two for the purposes of today and for how much time we have. But there are a whole host of mental health disorders: addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder. But anxiety and depression overarchingly tend to affect a lot of people in many ways. So let's first talk about what it means to meet criteria for a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. So what is anxiety? It's defined as excessive worry for more days than not for at least 6 months. So that means 4 out of the 7 days, you're experiencing a ton of worry that's difficult to control. And it can manifest as feeling easily fatigued, having some difficulty concentrating, muscle tension, sleep disturbance. And what's interesting is when we look at the research in Asian, South Indian individuals, anxiety doesn't really tend to manifest as anxiety. It tends to manifest as muscle tension, physiological responses. And so it's something to pay attention to. If your sleep is really disturbed, you may be anxious, something to consider. And there are a whole host of different anxiety conditions. You can have social phobia, fear of interacting with others. You can have panic attacks, which is when your heart starts to race a lot faster, you have shortness of breath, your palms are getting sweaty. You can have generalized anxiety disorder. This is fear of just day-to-day, everyday things. Where am I going to park at work? When I go to work, how is my boss going to interact with me? Things like that. And the question is, well, when does this occur? So there are a variety of life situations, abuse, severe loss, and medical concerns that can kind of increase that rate of anxiety. Depression. So for depression, it's more than just sadness. It's a deep sadness, emptiness, hopeless feeling that lasts at least 2 weeks where you're feeling more sad than not. And here, you might see that a lot of the symptoms that are observed in anxiety are also observed here in depression. And there's a reason for that. Anxiety and depression are highly comorbid or overlapping conditions. So if you have anxiety, you likely have depression and vice versa. And this can come off as significant loss of pleasure or interest, significant weight loss or gain, excessive or lack of sleep, worthlessness, as well as diminished concentration here. And the question is, well, why do we react this way? So when I talk about mental health, I want to emphasize that this is not just in your head, okay? And a lot of times we're like, just pray more and read the Bible. And those are true things. And there are sometimes a physiological and biological predisposition for why people interact this way. So to not get too into the nitty-gritty, we have two types of systems within our nervous system. One is called the sympathetic, or the fight or flight mode, and the other is called our parasympathetic, or the rest and digest mode. So both of these serve a purpose, and both of these are really important. But I want to emphasize, so for example, for the fight or flight mode, if you were in a burning building, you would want to quickly jump out of there and head out to safety. But it's when that sympathetic nervous system stays at this really high level of that fight or flight that causes this anxiety to be so overwhelming that you might need some additional help. And so we're going to address some ways in which we really work on that sympathetic nervous system, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. The other thing that is really important is that our thoughts that we experience matter. And so there is this triangle that has been known for long periods of times that really affect how we function. You have thoughts that affect your emotions, and then your emotions affect your behaviors. So what are thoughts? Words that you tell yourself, an internal dialogue that you experience on a day-to-day basis. The emotions are how you feel, and the behaviors are your actions, so what you do as a result of the thoughts and the emotions. So let's say, for example, you have this triggering event. So you applied for a job, and you get an email that says, "We regret to inform you, we have moved on with other candidates, we are no longer considering your application." Your thought might be, well, I'm never going to be good enough. This might then lead to some emotions like frustration, hopelessness, and sadness. You were really hoping to get this job. And then finally, this can lead to behaviors like procrastination, comparing yourselves to others, maybe even avoiding others and secluding yourself because you were really excited for this job, you were telling everybody, and now you can't have that job. And so what I really emphasize to people is, well, why did this thought occur in the first place? And what evidence do I have that this thought is useful? So what I say is, put your thoughts on trial and identify evidence either for that thought or against that thought. And when you look at the evidence, you can really start undermining and stopping these thoughts from getting to the point where you're experiencing a ton of anxiety, a ton of depressive symptoms. The other thing is this topic of cognitive distortion. So this is a really fancy term, but in simple definitions, it says, this is our brain's problematic way of making sense of the world by oversimplifying our thoughts and the way that we interact with the world. So here are a few examples. Catastrophizing, seeing only the worst possible outcome. So say, for example, your spouse usually texts you when they're on their way back from work. And for some reason that day they didn't text you. Sometimes, for people that have significant anxiety or depressive symptoms, they go to the worst case scenario. My spouse got in a car accident and they died. That's why they didn't text me back. And that's a real thought that comes into their head. And so a more logical thought would have been, oh, their phone must have died, or, oh, they may have forgotten to text me, or they're held up at work. So instead of going from logical thought A to B to C, it's A to Z, right? So that's a catastrophic thought. All or nothing type thoughts. These are thinking in absolutes, saying things like, you always act like that, or you never wash the dishes, when in reality, that's not the case, right? So all or nothing, we're not thinking about all the gray or the circumstances or the context of why our thoughts go straight to that. Mind reading, interpreting the thoughts of others without evidence. Say, for example, someone walks into this conference and they look at you a certain way. You might immediately think, why is this person mad at me? When in reality, they're like, what's the evidence? Did that person actually interact with you that day? Are they themselves maybe experiencing sadness about something that has nothing to do with you? These are all really important things. And then fortune telling, magnification, minimization, these are also additional thoughts, maximizing our mistakes but minimizing our achievements. All of us have experienced these day-to-day things in our life. And so what I really want to highlight is the fact that we are all very busy individuals. We have a hurried lifestyle. And so there's a book that was written by a man named John Mark Comer, and the title of the book is The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And he identifies a lot of these statistics, that the average American spends 705 hours on social media each year. The average iPhone user touches his or her phone 2,600 times a day. And I'm seeing some nods because everybody knows that it's true. The average American watches 2,700 hours of TV each year. 10,000 hours of video games are played by age 21. And 77% of young adults said that when nothing is occupying their attention, the first thing they do is reach for their phone. And so I would ask all of you, if you were to look at your iPhone's report of how much time you're spending, 4 to 6 hours a day, that's a significant amount of time. And then in contrast, how much time you're spending reading the Bible, man, it is a wake-up call, right? So when we think about my life is so busy, what are we filling our time with? What is causing the stress? What is causing our mood to fluctuate in the way that it does? So with all of that being said, what do we do? What are some actionable steps that we can take going forward? Well, let's first talk about ways to work on anxiety ourselves. The first thing is deep breathing. So all of us breathe. It's a part of our life, but I would argue that many of us don't breathe properly. A lot of us tend to breathe from our chest and not from our diaphragm. And so when you do deep intentional breathing, it's anxiety relieving in a lot of ways. So remember, before I talked about our sympathetic or our fight or flight mode and our parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest mode, deep breathing is a way to really help that rest and digest mode. So we're going to together do a deep breathing exercise, and I encourage all of us to do it. So this is how it's going to go. You're going to breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and then hold. So I'm going to lead y'all. Are you ready? Okay, and make sure you don't just, okay? Take the 4 seconds to breathe. And see, if you need to feel your diaphragm, go ahead and do it too. All right, ready? Here we go. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, and release. Okay. Even something as simple as that can be really helpful. I'm sure a lot of us are like, I didn't breathe that deeply in a long time, right? So, deep breathing, it works. I did it right before I came and gave this talk too. Second one, progressive muscle relaxation. So remember how I talked about us as Asian individuals, we tend to be more predisposed to having more muscle tension, to feeling a little bit more of that tension in our body. And so progressive muscle relaxation kind of helps you see the contrast between when we are pent up with our stress and when we release. So something as simple as squeezing your hands super tight or shrugging up your shoulders super tight and then releasing helps you just have that direct contrast between this is really anxiety inducing and this one's relieving. Grounding techniques. We've all heard the term mindfulness. It tends to be a really secular, common term. If you've ever done yoga before, it's something that they do. But I would say that grounding techniques are really helpful in us recentering our hearts and our minds. And so what it does is you're using your 5 senses to just identify what's going on in your environment. So for individuals that have panic attacks where they tend to have an out-of-body experience, grounding techniques can kind of help recenter them. So the first thing you do is you identify 5 things in this church that you see, right? So if you were to just think about the 5 things, there are probably things that you didn't see before, and some of us have been attending this church for 50, 60 years that now you've seen, right? 5 things that you see. 4 things that you hear. So if you hear things, right, you're hearing my voice, you're hearing a kid up on the balcony, you're hearing a little bit of crying, you're hearing some talking, right? 3 things you feel. What are 3 things that just sitting right now you can touch, you feel around you? 2 things that you smell, and then finally 1 thing that you taste. So by just identifying the 5 senses, it just helps recenter you. And then finally, staying organized. So all of us have a calendar. All of us live by a calendar where we put to-dos, and it helps us kind of stay organized. But what I would say is a lot of us don't do a good job of using our calendar appropriately. So a lot of times we have this long to-do list, and it can be overwhelming and anxiety-inducing. And what I would say is having a short-term to-do list and a long-term to-do list can actually be the most effective way of managing your anxiety and getting your expectations met. So a short-term to-do list is what you need to do during that week or during that day. A long-term to-do list, what needs to be done in 3, 4 weeks, in 6 months. In terms of depression, so the most helpful research-supported way for managing depression is activation, activating yourself, exercising. And I know a lot of us will say, I don't have time for exercise, but if you spent 4 to 6 hours on your phone, you have time to walk around while being on that phone. So everybody has time for exercise, and it is the #1 way of reducing not only chronic conditions, but also our mental health conditions. And I'm a neuropsychologist by trade. Whenever I talk to my patients about dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, if I told you that it reduced your risk of developing dementia or Alzheimer's by 50%, I think all of us would jump on a treadmill immediately, right? Diet, exercise, sleep, the biggest pieces that are helpful in our health. Scheduling, we already talked about. And then finally, something called sleep hygiene. So some of us have really bad sleep patterns where some of us are sleeping maybe 5 to 7 hours a day, and we're convincing ourselves that that's normal. Others of us have sleep apnea that needs to be checked out. And I'm telling you, it is going to change your life if you do get a CPAP and actually breathe properly when you're sleeping. But sleep hygiene in particular was created for individuals with insomnia. Insomnia is this condition where they just don't sleep. And with depression, we know that erratic sleep patterns are very common. So sleep hygiene is something that we really emphasize. This is as simple as saying things like set adequate sleep time at night and wake up at the same time every morning. If you wake up in the middle of the night, and if you're a frequent, you frequently wake up in the middle of the night, instead of reaching for your phone or something that's stimulating that can keep you awake, instead trying to go back to sleep by your own self with your thoughts. And if that's not helping, if you've been awake in the middle of the night for 20, 30 minutes, getting up out of bed, going to a different room, and doing something mundane like journaling, reading, something that's not involving TV or your phone can be really helpful in just making sure that your sleep pattern gets back to where it needs to be. So these are just individual ways that you can manage anxiety and depression. I want to highlight communication patterns too amongst individuals, not only that have mental health concerns, but also amongst just our everyday talk. And there's this piece called the OARS method, which is an acronym for open-ended questions, affirmation, reflections, and summarizing. And this is a really helpful communication technique to talk about sensitive topics with your kids, with your spouse, with someone that's struggling with a mental health concern. And so I'm going to explain it here. The O stands for open-ended questions. So this is inviting one to say more than a yes or no response. So for example, if I ask you, did you have a good day today? That is a yes or no response. Instead, if I ask, how was your day today? It elicits a much greater level of response from the individual to understand what's going on with them. Secondly, the A, affirmation, is a difficult one sometimes, especially when you're arguing with somebody. So say, for example, you just had an argument with an individual and you hear them out. An affirming response instead of accusing them would be, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I appreciate you telling me that. I didn't know that before, and I'll work on that going forward, right? It's a more accepting and understanding way of affirming that you understand their perspective. I don't necessarily agree with it, but here's what we can do going forward. It's a more solutions-oriented type of talk. Reflecting statements. So say, for example, I'm talking to somebody and they tell me, my boss just yelled at me, I feel like I'm going to lose my job, and my coworkers really don't like me. A reflecting type response would be, man, it sounds like you had a really hard day at work. How are you doing? Right? It's understanding where they're coming from, putting yourself in their shoes, and providing an empathetic response. And then summarizing is very simple. So for that last example I gave, I could just say, so it sounds like your boss yelled at you, you feel like you're going to lose your job, and your coworkers don't like you. Did I get all that right? And it allows them to be able to take that space to expand and give you a good response. So communication is extremely important for if you're working with somebody that is more stressed or anxious or depressed as well. All right. Towards the end of this presentation, what about unmanageable symptoms? So what about for individuals that you've been really trying to work on the anxiety and the depression and it's not getting anywhere? Well, there are evidence-based research treatments that are based in science, the biggest one of which is called cognitive behavior therapy. And the reason I really promote cognitive behavior therapy is it is research-oriented and based, and I think it most aligns with our Christian faith too. I think that we are able to tackle thoughts that are not helpful, and we are also able to develop skills that can help us work on our anxiety and depressive symptoms too. The other thing is, if you're finding that the anxiety and depression are so unmanageable, like nothing is working, medication may be an option. And I know that there tends to be hesitation with psychotropic medications because it means that you're crazy. It does not mean that you're crazy. A lot of people, from a physiological standpoint, require some medication to get them to function, to get them to be activated, to get them to the next step. And so medication doesn't necessarily have to be super long term. It can be short term, and it can kind of help in the short term to get you to where you need to be. And then finally, community. We always, especially us as Malayalis, like to keep things within our household. I think that is a proven fact. We don't want people knowing about what's going on. We don't want people to feel burdened by our anxiety and depression. And I think that is directly in contrast to the way that the Bible tells us to address these mental health concerns, where we're supposed to share our burdens with one another, to pray with one another. I'm not saying that 20 people have to know about your anxiety and depressive symptoms, but one or two close friends that you really trust can be really helpful in extending that mental health treatment and being an extension of therapy. So finally, we talked in a lot of topics today about hurry and our busy lifestyle. And what I want to really emphasize here are 4 helpful steps, I think, from a spiritual standpoint and from a mental health standpoint that can be useful for us going forward. The first of which is embracing silence and solitude. So finding space in your schedule to have quiet time daily. Quiet time is something that I think all of us struggle with. And when I say quiet time, I mean pure quiet time. So this may be just 5 minutes where you're in complete silence and you're just either in prayer where you're just listening and hearing from the Lord. You don't have to necessarily read your Bible during this quiet time, but it might be helpful. But this is something that's extremely important. And when we look at the Bible, we see that Jesus, in his 40 days in the wilderness, when he was fasting and praying and being with the Father, some would argue that that was his most vulnerable time because he was being attacked by Satan and he was hungry and he was all alone. But what I would say is that that's actually his strongest time because he was in solitude with the Father. He was ready to deflect whatever Satan had. And so silence and solitude can provide a lot of strength for us and can change the ways that we typically interact with stress and the daily anxieties that we face. Second is simplicity. So this is just getting rid of clutter and superficial things that are not needed. So simply, when we think about all the things that are in our closet, all the clothes that we haven't worn for years, all the devices that are in our home, getting rid of things and living a more succinct and simple lifestyle can be really important in getting rid of that hurry and that busyness that we tend to experience. Slowness, so changing the tempo and rhythms of one's heart. I am the first to mention that I always drive in the fastest lane or find the shortest line in the grocery store. But what if we try to just take time and be slow? When we think about what the Bible says about God's character, God is slow to anger. He is abounding in love. When the disciples and Jesus were on the water and the waves and the winds were coming, the disciples were so worried. They were busy. They were wanting to fix the situation. And Jesus is sleeping. He's hanging out. He is slow. He has a pace that's slow. And so if we change our tempo and rhythm of our heart, I think we might also start to experience less busyness, less hurry, less stress. There was a quote out there that said, if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. And I think that that is something that's very real. And then finally, Sabbath, taking a day of rest. When we think about Sabbath back in the Old Testament, you know, it's a complete day where there's no work and anything like that. What I would say is you don't necessarily have to do no work, but you should take one day where you are truly spending time just with your family, walking around in your neighborhood, going to a park, making cookies, doing something that is just keeping you restful and ready and prepared for the week. And so those are some solutions that can be helpful. So in summary, anxiety and depression symptoms affect all of us. There are life stressors. We can have these thought patterns that are hurtful, and hurry can influence our daily lives. But effective management strategies, exercise, deep breathing, pointing to evidence, good community can be really useful. And then finally, prayer, reading the Bible, and then practices in our life like silence, simplicity, slowness, and Sabbath can end up posturing our hearts towards Jesus, and it's something that can be extremely helpful for us. So with that, I just want to thank you all for your time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Abel, for receiving and accepting our invitation to come and present about stress and anxiety. We all know that one or other way, you always get stress or anxiety. പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് നമ്മൾ മലയാളി കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റിയെ കുറിച്ച് പറയുവാണെങ്കിൽ നമ്മളെല്ലാം ഉള്ളിലൊതുക്കി നമ്മുടെ തന്നെ നല്ലൊരു കുപ്പായത്തിൻ്റെ പുറത്ത് നമ്മളിങ്ങനെ വന്ന് എല്ലാം മനസ്സിൽ ആരോടും പറയത്തില്ല. പക്ഷേ ഏബൽ പറഞ്ഞ പോലെ സ്റ്റഡീസ് പ്രൂവ് ദാറ്റ് the communicating with each other, spending in a group, it helps everyone. Especially last 4 points summarize here that it's a lot. Simply silence and simplicity and slowness and a Sabbath. I know, എനിക്കിന്ന് വീട്ടിൽ പോകേണ്ടി വരത്തില്ല, കാരണം വീട്ടിൽ എന്നെ കയറത്തില്ല. കാരണം ഇതൊന്നും ഫോളോ ചെയ്യാത്ത ഒരാളാണ് ഞാനൊന്നും വീട്ടിൽ നിന്ന് കേൾക്കുന്നത് ഇത് തന്നെയാണ്. പക്ഷേ I know it's very important for our life to get our life and stress balance. And we, on behalf of 22nd Yuvajana Sakhyam National Conference and all the delegates gathered here, we extend our thanks and all appreciation and good luck to you. Thank you very much, Abel. Give him a round of applause.